the most stimulating and controversial displays at the 1982 Chelsea Flower Show was presented by CM Brophy Limited. It was conceived by Danish-born landscape architect Preben Jakobsen.
Essentially, the whole garden is a sculpture garden. You've got to perceive it as a piece of sculpture in much the same way that the sculpture generally is understood to be sculpture. So indeed, the fence is a sculpture. We regard our fence design as sculpture. We regard the pergola as sculpture. And we've specially designed for the garden an outdoor fireplace, which indeed can also be regarded as a piece of sculpture. So essentially, it's to do with art and not necessarily the science of plants. The role of the plants to the sculpture is, in this case, secondary, but they are, of course, complementary. They are very much part and parcel of a landscape architect's design vocabulary. If you asked him point blank, when he works with a scale of plants from, say, 0 to 10, and he would immediately put flowers at the bottom of the list on the basis that flowers only last for a relatively short time, whereas foliage gives you all year round permanence. We like to think it's the garden of today. It's a pointer to the future. It's the gardens we're going to see tomorrow. Essentially, the overall design concept is one of respecting the genius loci, that is to say, what you find on the site. So here we have a sloping site, and we have attempted to integrate these rather beautiful linear brick risers. One interesting factor about this garden is we, again, as landscape architects, are trained to exploit optical illusions, and if you look at the plan, you will find that the garden is approximately twice as long as wide. But indeed the garden actually appears wider than long because we have drawn these linear terraces across the slope, and therefore the eye tends to pick up the rhythmic pattern of the lines going across the garden, which then deepens the perspective. We have developed a dynarhythmic pattern both in the paving and in the fence based on traditional Oriental design philosophies on a 3-5-7 rhythm. Essentially, it's to do with Euclidean geometry, and we subdivide a space down into geometrical patterns. We quite often work with the golden rectangle as a basis for our design skeleton. By design skeleton, I mean a rectangle or square form which the garden have now, and the subdivisions of the terraces within that particular rectangle or square. You will note that the shadowy bit, which is created by the risers in the terraces, are particularly important to us. And as this garden has been designed against the sun, I believe there's a photographic phrase called contre jour, which means against the light. To me, designing against the light is very important. So what we have done, we've exploited the joint lines in the paving by emphasizing them transversely across the garden. So when they are highlighted by the sun, they are picked out particularly, but across the garden, the pavers have been butt jointed closely together. We were very lucky to find a firm called Blocklis who happened to have some beautiful volcanic-looking, earthy-colored pavers, which complements the deep blue stained fence. And I think the other beauty and feature of this particular fence is that it's inward-looking, and there is a highly structured linear pattern in the fence. But you will note that the Aries rails, that is to say the rails that hold the fence up, are all hidden on the rear face. So one gets an illusion of linear lines disappearing gradually into the horizon. We felt barbecues are readily accepted in a garden, and why not an outdoor fireplace? It seems so obvious that when you have garden furniture, which we also regard as very much part of the design, then one ought to have an attractive outdoor fireplace for the cooler evenings. And in this particular case, we were lucky to find a material called Core 10 steel. The beauty of that steel is that it creates a surface patina of rust. The average person in the street would probably shriek with horror, but in this case, the rust is like a paint that develops on the surface of the fireplace, and you can leave it out in all weathers. In other words, totally maintenance-free, very much on the concept that the whole garden is essentially also a maintenance-free garden. The placing of the trees are first and foremost the strong keynotes of planting design, and it was necessary to, in this case, to find a very large pyramidal tree, and we were lucky enough at True Vale Nurseries in Herefordshire to find that they have recently imported from Italy some very large specimen of palms and magnolias. You'll also note that we tend to work with triangles. That's to say, we use what we call a bridging technique. We bridge the plant material. In other words, your eye will move from the left to the right and then gradually draw it back up into the far horizon. Here you have three sort of lemon-colored conifers of a very globular round shape, and they are obviously strong keynotes in the design. They are, in a sense, the highlight, what we call an accent plant. It brings an accent into the design, and we complement that with ground cover, which is of a lower nature, and on the ground cover we actually put certain accent plants. So, in a sense, we demonstrate the full quality of the plant material. Too often, planting design can become a fruit salad, just a great mixture, what I sometimes would like to call a stamp collection of plants, where as this should be a pleasing feature in a garden. It should be restful on the eye, and again, hence colour. Colour would tend to jar. In order to emphasize the red brick pavia's colour, we selected a low-growing ground cover, and we were fortunate to have the cooperation of Bloom's Nurseries in Bressingham, who of course are famous for their ground covers, in particular conifers, and we have selected a particular one called Juniperus squamata blue carpet. Essentially all gardens should have a secret corner. After all, the garden is an extension of the house, and in the manner in which you would place furniture within the house or your room, you furnish the garden, and it's attractive to be able to sit in the corner of the garden. And so what we've done, we have sited a mirror at the end of the pergola in order to extend visually. Here, this is where the optical illusion bit comes in order to double the length of the pergola. So in other words, for the same money, you get twice the effect, in other words, double value. But not only that, you get the visual value, which is perhaps more important and to the point. The mirror reflects a piece of sculpture by the Japanese sculptor Rentaro Yagi in white marble, which has been specially imported, like all the other sculptures here, from Italy. And I'm particularly pleased about this particular vertical piece and the way in which we've been able to associate Oriental garden design, because the hostas come from Japan, and the link between a Japanese sculpture, culturally anyway, is obviously a subtlety, but perhaps worth mentioning. We have selected the furniture from a co-fellow exhibitor at Chelsea, Charles Weary. Charles Weary comes from the Cotswolds, like myself. I'm happy to be associated with Charles Weary, we've selected from his range what we believe to be his best pieces. The choice of color is mine, and we've asked him to apply a mandarin color. I mentioned earlier about the various oriental aspects of garden design, and of course the mandarin red goes particularly well with the deep blue stain called iris. So we have mandarin red and iris as a color combination. Garden lighting, what we call the lightscape and the nightscape, is an important aspect of garden design. It's an extent of the use of the garden into the early hours of the morning if necessary. My recent work is highly structured with a heavy reliance of dominant patterns which one finds in nature. For example, if you wander along a cliff face under the beach, you will find strong linear patterns in the cliff face. Well, when you look at this particular garden, you will see this reflected in the fence design. So, to me, the boulders and rocks and so on, which one finds in nature, is a strong inspirational point. There's a misconception about what nature is, and possibly also about garden design. Nature is highly structured, and if you look into a microscope, as I did many years ago at Kew Gardens, you'll find that you find some wonderful linear patterns and highly complex patterns developing under the microscope. To me, garden design is a philosophy, a way of life. All my life I've been in garden design, and I've been greatly influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous American architect, ALCA, the great Finnish architect, and also Lutyens, of course, the great English architect. All these architects had one thing in common: a deep respect for the environment, a deep respect for nature, and I like to think I also a deep respect for nature, and I hope through my design that this comes across, that one is paying back that respect for Mother Nature.
The project was created in association with Tony Brophy, and it was his ambition to be able to present something which challenged and extended current standards and ideas in garden design.
I feel quite strongly that this garden represents the best in contemporary design and workmanship. We deliberately set out with Preben Jakobsen to carry through what we started doing last year in the garden, which we were fortunate enough to get the Garden of the Year award for. And that garden, as this garden does, represents and reflects the best in design and the best in workmanship. And by coming to Chelsea and creating this sculptural garden, and Preben has explained how the garden is intended to read as a total sculptural statement, that by bringing it here and exposing it to the hundreds of thousands of people who flock through Chelsea, we were hoping to create a greater awareness of good design and an appreciation of what is feasible in even the smallest of plots by utilising a lot of the design criterion that are used here, and also the materials, the majority of which are readily available and quite basic. The initial inception was in Preben Jakobsen's head. Through the pragmatic relationship that we've got with him, we have interpreted his very sophisticated design notions into reality, and one hopes that the general public, by simply looking and also having the whole concept and the details explained, that they can appreciate gardens and art and beauty to a greater extent.